Instagram, Hancock. In a perfect world, take 2.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it depends how you define a perfect world. I feel incredibly lucky to be born in a human body and to live in this amazing realm with all its beauty and all its danger and all its power. But clearly it's not. But perhaps that is perfect. Perhaps the fact that there are contradictions, perhaps the fact that there is pain as well as joy, perhaps the fact that we are constantly confronted with difficult choices, perhaps the fact that there is so much darkness as well as so much light, perhaps that's all what's necessary to make a perfect world.
It's the full tapestry.
Yeah, where you can actually learn stuff. You know, if it was all sweetness and light and everything was looked after and there was no jeopardy and no choices that could lead you down dark paths, then you would never learn anything at all, you know.
Homogeneity of heaven, almost.
Yeah, and it would be pointless in a way. I feel this, that part of there is undoubtedly a great deal of darkness in our world, and as well as light. But in the absence of the darkness, I don't see. I feel intuitively, and I cannot prove it, that we are here as spirits to learn, to grow, to develop, to emerge from this particular incarnation. Maybe slightly further ahead in some way than we were when we arrived. And for that to happen, there does need to be this dark and light, I think.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, no, before we get into some of those, because that brings up a lot of the issues, you know, through your career, I guess. What would you describe? I mean, you're a journalist and you're an author, but there's this whole archaeology and there's astroarchaeology.
Yeah.
There's a few different terms for the type of material you write about or have been the starting point of those things. How do you?
Well, I don't define myself as anything really, except for an outsider from mainstream culture, and bringing a fairly rigorous and thorough approach to anything that I choose to investigate. Most of the things that have happened in my career have been or appeared to be accidental. I've not made specific choices that led me in particular directions. I just found that this was what I was doing next. For a long time I was in certain ways in mainstream journalism. My last mainstream journalistic role was East Africa correspondent for The Economist. I was based in Nairobi in Kenya. I travelled very widely around the region, and I was at that time. This takes me through the late 70s into the early 80s. I was interested in current affairs and politics and economics. I had no notion of historical mysteries, not even much background reading in that area. But it was because of the encounter with Ethiopia's claim to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant. Ethiopia was on my beat as a foreign correspondent, and I found myself in the city of Aksum, I guess in 1982 or 1983, in northern Ethiopia, at that time in the center of a war zone. And I was introduced to this priest who was kept almost a prisoner in a little chapel in the grounds of the St. Mary of Zion Cathedral, and he told me that his role was to guard the Ark of the Covenant.
Wow.
And, you know, I thought, well, this is amazing. I'd actually just seen the Indiana Jones movie a little bit before that, so I knew what the Ark of the Covenant was. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have even known what it was. And I thought, this is what an incredible claim to make. And you know, could there be anything to it? And I gradually, as a background interest, started to research Ethiopia's claim to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant, and I started to encounter mainstream academics who were very derisive about it and just dismissed it as a self-aggrandizement of the Ethiopians in myth, that they were seeking to make themselves, you know, look wonderful. But actually there were so many anomalies and problems surrounding this claim: the presence of Ethiopian Jews practicing a very Old Testament form of Judaism, the fact that it is the only culture in the world that has a living tradition of venerating the Ark of the Covenant. All of these things made me think, well, hang on, you know, I don't have to listen to the academics, and what do they know anyway? They've not done the deep research, gone out into remote rural areas as I have done, and talked to Ethiopian Jews and talked to Coptic Christians and heard their views on this. There's something going on here. So that led me into investigating the Ark of the Covenant, and that was moving very far away from my previous. I want to close that door. That was moving very far away from my previous interests in current affairs, during the 80s I wrote a book about foreign aid called Lords of Poverty. And again, I think the only thing in common between that book and the kind of stuff I do now is that I was an outsider looking in rather than writing from the center of a system. I was outside, and the view generally in the 80s was that foreign aid was a very good thing. But I saw it as a very bad thing, which was very harmful and which was not empowering local communities but was empowering the bureaucrats and middlemen. So I wrote a very critical book about foreign aid. But while I was doing that, in the background I was researching the story of the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia and becoming more and more convinced that there was a story to tell, and eventually published that as late as 1992 in my book The Sign and the Seal. But by then I had become, just through this accidental encounter in northern Ethiopia in 1982 or 83, I had been drawn in to the realm of historical mystery, and I had come to realize that this was a fascinating area of inquiry, and that the further back we went into history, back 5,000 years, you run out of documents. There are no documentary sources. All we have is myth and tradition and a little bit of scratching around in the sand by archaeologists to tell us actually what our story was then. And I began to feel that there were a lot of untold stories, and that the same skills that I had brought to investigating current affairs could be brought to investigating the mysteries of the past.
Well, that's what interests me, about your character. I've been seeing a few of your performances and your lectures here on the Origins of Consciousness tour here in Australia, and you are a professional, and then there's a lot of because you've come from the mainstream, you've had that rigorous sort of training as a journalist and as an author, and been able to meet critics on their level and talk the right language and be met even if they don't agree with the ideas you're pursuing. What interests me is that there seems to be, and this might be a generalization, but there's another journalist may have met that man in Ethiopia and just dismissed it, like a lot of the academics do, a lot of the people with agendas do within their streams. But it takes a certain type of mind or potential, like a seed that's there ready to blossom. Yeah. And there's other people that, to pick a name out of a hat, someone like David Icke, who's come from a mainstream, journalistic, again British background. It seems like if you can come from within the herd and then reveal yourself as a dark sheep, black sheep, you can get away with more. Where it takes a lot more momentum and accrued sort of energy to build up a profile outside, because psychedelics or ancient mysteries or things like that are quite often regulated to the New Age sort of.
I think there's no doubt in terms of I believe I was very fortunate in many ways in the way that the public received my early books about historical mysteries, particularly The Sign and the Seal and Fingerprints of the Gods, which took me by surprise. I had no concept that I was writing a book that was going to sell millions of copies and would be read all over the world. But I do actually think that part of the reason people were prepared to pick that book up, because it's not the first book that's been written about the idea of a lost civilization or mysteries in our past. I do think that part of the reason why people were prepared to pick that book up was because I was seen as having this mainstream profile, and that therefore might be in some way a more credible witness on the subject than others who didn't have that.
Do you know what that reminds me of? There's a little analogy that the shamans of the Amazon, a lot of it is showmanship. There's definitely vegetal magic and things that they're doing, but it's the authority that the figure has in what they're doing, how they present. And in the West, if you put on a white lab coat surrounded by a big machine, you have the authority of a doctor, and the placebo effect, a lot of healing happens. But it's interesting, as a media figure, if you're coming from that background, it probably has some of that same weight with a lot of...
I think so. I think it did. It undoubtedly helped the books, and helped me. At the end of the day, then the mainstream critical apparatus and their friends in the media, all their guns were then turned on me for many years after that, and there was, I was subjected to the most extraordinarily sustained barrage of attacks and.
From the academic community?
From the academic community and from mainstream media linked to the academic community.
Do you think that's specifically linked to the fact that it was so popular?
Oh, definitely, yes. If my books had not been popular, why bother to criticise? The first defense of the mainstream when a central idea is attacked is to ignore the attack. And I think it became difficult to ignore me because there was such a huge readership of the books. And I know that academics were very envious of that and very jealous. Why should this jumped-up journalist be selling millions of copies when we're not selling more than 200 or 300 copies?
Around that same time, it might have been in the publishing industry here, but the Celestine Prophecy was very, very popular.
Celestine Prophecy was out somewhere around about there, yeah.
And it seems to be, there's a zeitgeist, or there's an energy of the times when there's certain things become probable, possible within that cultural...
I believe that was the case. I believe that was the other reason that Fingerprints of the Gods worked. One, because I was seen to be coming to the subject from a place of rigour and serious, detailed inquiry. And I do like to think, regardless of whatever one's background is, I do like to think that I do actually research my subjects thoroughly and provide readers with the sources on which I draw. But the other reason that the book struck a nerve was because that nerve was already there to be struck. There was something in the air in the early 90s which was very questioning, and I see that bearing fruits even today, but it was very questioning about the story of our history. There were other discoveries. I don't believe that Fingerprints of the Gods would have been a successful book if it hadn't been for people like John Anthony West, for example, working with, and Professor Robert Schoch at Boston University, working on the geology of the Sphinx in the early 90s, suggesting, hey, the Sphinx actually might be 12,000 years old, not 4,500 years old. Rand and Rose Flemath working on Antarctica and on the issue of Earth crust displacement. Robert Bauval, crucial figure, drawing attention to the possibility that the pyramids may be laid out on the ground in the pattern of the 3 stars of Orion's belt and what all that might mean. All of that was in the air, and there were these different ideas out there, and I think people were constantly hearing that there were questions being raised over history and prehistory. And what I did was primarily a journalistic job. I came in and I talked to all the key characters and all the key players, and I reached certain conclusions of my own, and I put those together into a large, thoroughly footnoted book called Fingerprints of the Gods.
I think that's often what is lacking in modern culture, is that they don't weave together all the different strands of information. We have data, and rarely then we have information, but rarely do we have wisdom from that. It doesn't cascade up the thing. So when someone can pull together those strands, and it reveals perhaps a whole new paradigm that I don't want to acknowledge. I think that's true, and I think that was my main role with Fingerprints of the Gods was a work of synthesis. Was to bring together all of this material and say, behind this there appears to be a bigger picture. There appears to be something going on that we need to pay attention to. And I've never claimed, and I don't claim now, to be 100% right about everything. I just think that we deserve, as people, as a culture, as a society, to have thoroughly argued alternative points of view on issues, that there is too much dominance of a mainstream point of view, which is actually very monolithic. It's based on certain ideas about science and what science is. It's all about weighing and measuring and counting. It's about authority, so that the Professor X or Dr. Y says that things are so, then it is so. And it's about the illusion that history is a series of facts, when I've come to feel very strongly that history is a series of opinions. And the further back you go, the more flimsy evidence is that those opinions rest on. So I felt there was room and a need for a thoroughly argued alternative point of view. So in general,
and if I may add, part of it also is was this tremendous mood of curiosity and questioning that was in the air in the early 90s, and in a sense what my book did was provide people with ammunition to pursue their own research interests and say, well, let's go and look at this, let's go and look at that. And I've had so many heartwarming letters and responses from people to say, we take Fingerprints of the Gods with us, we follow your journey, and it's helped us in the research that we're doing.
Well, tell us just a little bit about the ammunition. Like the theme of your book is that there's an culture or a mother culture that perhaps preceded his story, and then the known historical. The theme,
the broad theme, is that first of all we have this enormous body of testimony called myth and tradition from all around the world, which is remarkably consistent. which says that at some time, it's set in a remote past, but it's quite rare, but it does happen for dates to be put on it. At some time in the remote past, there was a kind of golden age of humanity. There was a high civilization which was capable of extraordinary feats, which was capable of navigating and exploring the entire world, which could manipulate and organize gigantic blocks of stone into huge structures, which understood the nature of the universe and the solar system, which understood the dimensions of the earth, and that for some reason this civilization fell out of harmony with the universe, or fell out of harmony with the gods, and was destroyed by a gigantic global cataclysm, most often characterized as a flood. I don't need to fantasize any of that, because all of that is out there.
Every culture in the world
has these myths and traditions, and some cultures put dates on it. Plato put dates on it. When he passed down the story of Atlantis, he said it was 9,000 years before the time of Solon that Atlantis was destroyed. That's 9,600 BC in our calendar, 11,600 years ago. And the Kumari Kandam tradition in southern India, which speaks of a much more extensive southern lands of India that extended deep into the Southern Ocean, that there was a high civilization there, that there were universities, there were academies. It was called the Sangam tradition. This also has dates put on it, and those dates are very similar to Plato's dates, 11 or 12,000 years ago in our calendar. But generally, it's set in a remote but undated past. But occasionally, you get these little glimpses of dates. So, all of that is there. And then there are the problems with mainstream history, the anomalies, like the Sphinx, like the work that Robert and John did on the Sphinx, suggesting that the Sphinx was exposed to thousands of years of heavy rainfall before the present climatic regime in Egypt set in. It's been pretty dry in Egypt for the last 5,000 years, but there was a time when it was very rainy, and that's what the Sphinx seems to speak to. And astronomy, a very, very important element of this, which we neglect, I believe, at our peril, because it's quite clear that ancient civilizations all around the world were very focused on the heavens, and were about creating monuments that in some way married heaven and earth. That there was a sort of symbolic perfection seen in the heavens, and there was this worldwide notion, which is very difficult to imagine was independently invented in cultures all around the world, that if you can replicate upon the ground what you see in the heavens, even though it may not be a perfect copy, it will somehow draw down the power of the universe and anchor us to the heavens, and anchor us to some aspiration of perfection. And so this is found everywhere around the world, and the weird anomaly, because now, you see, in urban Western society, we don't see the stars very often. There's so much light pollution. It's very difficult to see them. If you do see them, they're just these distant points of light. It's very difficult to get a sense of order about it. But under clear ancient skies, and as you can still find in deserts or mountainous areas today, the starry vault just looms over you like just an incredible jewel.
It's almost psychedelic in itself.
It's almost psychedelic in itself. And actually, if you start to watch it, you over a long period of time, you start to notice things. You start to notice certain regularities. And if you actually have a strong, doesn't even have to be written, a strong oral tradition, and pass that tradition down, you will also start to notice certain changes that take place, that something is unfolding in the heavens over a very long period of time. And the most obvious is what we call the precession of the equinoxes, that the background stars against which the sun is seen to rise on. There are key moments in the year. There is the summer. The summer solstice. Obviously, that's in the northern hemisphere. That's the 21st of June. That's the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere, and the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, 21st of December. That's the summer solstice in the southern hemisphere. These are, speaking of the northern hemisphere, the summer solstice is the longest day of the year. The winter solstice is the shortest day of the year, and of course the seasons are reversed in the southern hemisphere. But it's basically the same thing. So in the northern hemisphere, the sun is rising furthest north of east on the summer solstice, swings like a pendulum along the horizon, furthest south of east on the winter solstice, and absolutely due east, perfect due east on the equinoxes, when night and day are of equal length, 21st of March and 21st of September. And if you take you could actually take any one of those markers you like. They're the extreme range of the sun, south, north, and dead center. But dead center seems to be the one intuitively that most cultures have gone for. And it may not only be intuitive, this may be an inherited idea that's been passed down globally. Look where the sun is rising on the horizon on that day when night and day are of exactly equal length. Make a monument that points at that, if you like, which is what the Great Sphinx does. It points perfectly at the rising sun on the spring equinox, and it always will point perfectly at the rising sun on the spring equinox, because due east is due east. But what you will notice changes is the stars that are sitting on the horizon an hour before the sun rises. It might be 1,000 years you keep passing down the information. It's basically the same group of stars, but they've slightly moved along in relation to that central marker. And roughly every 2,160 years, which is 30 degrees along what's called the ecliptic, every 2,160 years you shift from one house of the zodiac to another. There's this grand dance of the zodiacal constellations behind the sun, and this appears to be caused by a wobble on the axis of the Earth. It's our viewing platform from which we observe the stars. As its orientation changes in the heavens, the stars that rise at particular seasons change, and this is what happens with the precession of the equinox. It may have another cause, but the verity is it's a marker, and you can say that that for the last 2,000 years the sun has been rising in the constellation of Pisces, but it's shifting now into Aquarius, and for the next 2,000 plus years it'll be rising in the constellation of Aquarius. And as you go back into time, you found that other constellations house the sun, and this is where it gets interesting. Because it seems that monuments were used to memorialize or mark particular dates, particular times, particular periods. And one of the things that intrigued me was the way the Giza plateau seems to replicate the heavens, not in 2500 BC, which is the date that Orthodox Egyptology gives to the Giza plateau, but in 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago, many thousands of years earlier. There's a really quite extraordinary match between the key monuments and the key images in the heavens at that time, particularly the Sphinx and Leo, Orion's belt, and the pyramids, the Milky Way and the Nile. All of these line up at dawn on the spring equinox, and it's as though this is the sky that we built on the ground, and it speaks to that date. And then you have to ask yourself, does that mean that Giza was actually created not in 2500 BC, but 10,000 years earlier than that? And or does it mean that for the creators of Giza that date was particularly important, and they understood the movements of the heavens, and they wished to use this regular mathematical dance of the constellations to memorialize that date? One or other is possible, but once you get to grips with the ancient architecture at Giza, the notion that the Sphinx is much older, and the whole scale of the thing, you begin to wonder whether actually there was something there. Perhaps not the pyramids as we see them today, but something enormous involving the Sphinx, involving gigantic platforms.
Even the word monument seems a very diluted form for what it potentially could have been, more like some type of machinery or some type of device.
Again, I can only tell you what my personal view is, and I believe that Giza, the three great pyramids, the Sphinx, the underground passageways and chambers that are part of the story of the Giza plateau, and the megalithic temples around the Giza plateau are all part of some kind of giant initiation machine. They're all about a setting in which it becomes possible to deeply explore the mystery of what it is to be alive, and the question that the ancient Egyptians always asked, which is what happens to us when we die. I think that whole structure is not about burying pharaohs. It's about creating a setting in which deeply altered states of consciousness could be pursued, to investigate in an almost scientific manner everything that is beyond the realm of this material world.
So I'm just sort of grokking some intuitive inflection here, where it's almost like the machinery of a holographic universe. If you're going to not just connect to the stars and honour the stars, but somehow we're saying anchor them, and not just to bring them down, but for you to be able to travel, like this whole Stargate idea. But you were saying, they're not tombs. The Great Pyramid is not like a tomb. It's almost, you're saying, in microcosm they've created the architecture of it replicates what's above in the heavens, and it's like as above, so below.
Something hidden in time in the heavens. That's the curious thing. And they speak of the hidden circle of the Duat. The Duat was their name for their afterlife kingdom through which we travel after death. And it was linked to a particular region of the sky, and it happens to be that that's the region of the sky that's replicated on the ground at Giza, but it's hidden in time. It's not. It's not today.
So what I'm understanding from all this as well is that the powers that be, and I think there's a lot of vested interest that may be disparate, and they might not be working together in a classical type of conspiracy agenda, but it's just that the powers that be are holding on to the paradigm, and if they were to acknowledge not just that their dates were out and that the physical history books, it's the reasons behind it. It's not just to have an artifact, it's why did we create that artifact, what type of culture, how did they live, and then to have that example, it opens up more than the human experience in its very narrow bandwidth they've allowed us to believe in now.
Definitely. I've come to feel very strongly that mainstream history and archaeology, whether consciously or not, is part of the mind control system that we have in the world today. It's part of telling us how to think. It's part of telling us how reality is. And so there's this very rigid, narrow view of the story of history, that we were hunter-gatherers, somehow we stumbled across agriculture. Agriculture made possible the origins of the first cities, and we entered this realm of production and consumption that dominates the modern world today, where actually, if you listen to the messages of 21st century society as expressed through advertising and the media, there is no transcendent purpose to our lives. We are just meat, and we are here to consume and produce, to buy and sell from one another, and we're encouraged to borrow money in order to buy more, and the whole system revolves around production and consumption. But that system is weirdly anchored in history. It's anchored in a notion of history that somehow this is what we're for, emerges from the picture of history that mainstream academia gives us, and that's why an alternative vision of history is actually deeply subversive, because it removes the foundations upon which the entire modern structure of control and economic and state power is based. It just pulls the rug out completely from under that structure and says this rests on foundations of sand, and that underneath there's some huge missing story that maybe we as creatures are not materially bound in the way that we've been taught to believe we are, that maybe mechanical advantage is not the only way to move huge blocks of stone, that possibly the legends and traditions are true, that there was this enormous power, psychic power, if you like, of the mind that was harnessed at one point, and that the exploration of alternate dimensions of reality is really a possibility for us. It's something that we can do. That's so much denied in the modern world, and that feeds into the modern world's hatred of psychedelics, because just as a thoroughly researched alternative history is deeply subversive, so also are psychedelics in terms of the level of experience. They tell us, no, this material reality is definitely not all there is. There is much, much more to reality. It's much deeper, it's much wider, it's much more strange than it appears to be. So they are also deconditioning agents. And so it's, for me, all of these things come together. They're all part of the same process. Yeah.
What I'm interested in, then, you were describing, how you got into ancient mysteries, and that's sort of this, like, how far down the rabbit hole does this mystery go? Because once you get into that, and we get into the culture, and then who they were, what they did, how they did it, and so many previous cultures seem to have used psychedelics as part of their connection with the earth, and connection with the stars and reality. How did you then start to embrace the psych? I mean, you started to create a readership for the ancient mysteries, but then you've also, you've got, I guess, an integrity and a responsibility to tell the truth, and the deeper you dig, the more the truth gets mind-blowing.
Yeah, it really gets mind-blowing. I reached a point where I felt that as an individual I had contributed about as much as I could, for the moment anyway, to unearthing the possibility that there's been a huge forgotten episode in human history, and to presenting solid or at least compelling evidence for that case. And I definitely put my life into this project. 7 years of scuba diving all around the world was a major mission and a major commitment for me, and it involved very definite physical risks and privations. But this was which resulted in my book Underworld. Once I'd done that, and once I'd said, actually, yes, there are structures underwater which are not explained, but which could only have been built before sea levels rose 12,000 or more years ago, I felt that I had, at least for the moment, come to the end of that particular story, and that there was a danger that I would just end up repeating myself and running down the same furrows again and again, and that undoubtedly there's much more evidence to unearth, but maybe I wasn't going to be the one to unearth it. Maybe that's for somebody else to do, and I'd done as much as I could, and it was at that time that I became interested in the other side of the story. If there was a great lost civilization, as I believe there was, it's also true that there were hunter-gatherers in the world, just as there are today. We have a huge urban, monolithic culture, which you can just wherever you touch down, whether it's Sydney or New York or London or Tokyo, you're basically in the same space, which is this urban culture that we've created, and it's very dominant, and it's an octopus which is tightly gripping around the world. But nevertheless, even today, with this massively dominant technological global civilization that we have, there are still hunter-gatherer cultures. There are tribal cultures. There are cultures who are living deeply in tune with ancient nature, as, for example, we find in the Amazon. So when I say that I believe there's been a great forgotten episode in human history, that does not exclude the fact that there were also at that time people who were living at the hunter-gatherer state of living, and who left their marks also on the land, and who left their art everywhere. And it's not to say that they were primitive, and it may well be the case that the civilization that we lost was deeply coloured by those kinds of experiences that are more typically associated with hunter-gatherer societies. And that's actually why I find very intriguing, and it's almost opening the door to me thinking one day I will write a follow-up to Fingerprints of the Gods. I find very intriguing a particular megalithic site in Turkey, which is called Gobekli Tepe, and which in itself completely explodes the mainstream timeline of history, because it is 12,000 plus years old. That is 7,000 years older than the other great megalithic sites that are known around the world. 7,000 years older, and it consists of gigantic. It's a gigantic series of effectively of stone circles with monoliths weighing 25 tons, arranged in a fantastic scale, and which also has carvings of animals and figures that are very reminiscent of Upper Paleolithic art on it, and I'm just wondering again that I get the sense of just lifting the edge of a veil and looking beyond into something that really hasn't been considered before, that maybe those cultures that we called the Upper Paleolithic, the hunter-gatherer cultures, maybe they were connected strongly to this episode, not just peripheral to it, but connected to it in some way. At any rate, I got interested in cave art and what it is, and it's so amazing, it's so beautiful and so powerful, and there it is, and there's thousands of years of it, from Chauvet Cave in France 33,000 years ago right down to about 12,000 years ago. You get this amazing episode of cave painting, and I wanted to know what that was, and I wanted to understand that, and that's what led me to write my book, Supernatural, Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind.
The cave art was the gateway drug for you?
The cave art was the gateway drug for me, and then I, again, as I do whenever I'm researching a subject, the first thing I do is try to acquaint myself with what do the mainstream say about this. I can't ignore that. I need to know what they're saying and what they're thinking, and that's where I came across quite by chance. And oddly, this was before I came across Terence McKenna's amazing work in Food of the Gods. I came across the work of David Lewis Williams, who's a professor of archaeology at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. And David Lewis Williams, over a period of 20 years from 1980s through to early 2000s, has expounded a really convincing explanation of cave art, which initially was, as is usually the case with new ideas, was derided by other mainstream academics, but today is pretty widely accepted and is regarded as the main thing, that this was not hunting magic, this was not some sort of primitive structuralism, that this was an art of visions, this was the art of ancient shamanic cultures, whose shamans were, as shamans do today, deeply exploring altered states of consciousness, and who were returning from those altered states to manifest on the cave walls, sometimes 5 kilometers underground in total darkness, to manifest on the cave walls the imagery that they had seen in trance. And David makes a powerful and compelling case. And once I'd absorbed that case that David Lewis Williams makes, it was clear to me where I needed to go next, which was I needed to take psychedelics, which I hadn't done. I had one experience with LSD in 1974. I did get heavily involved with marijuana in 1987, but that's not a psychedelic. I mean, well, it can be sometimes, but it's not really at all a psychedelic. And I had a very long relationship with marijuana from 1987 through until 2011. But psychedelics, I had only encountered once, and that was in 1974 at the Windsor Free Festival outside London, when I had, just by chance, somebody gave me some LSD and I took it and I had an amazing night. Very powerful, but fun. But after that, I actually said to myself, I'm not going to take psychedelics anymore. Because I'd heard about how it might go the other way, and I was afraid. I thought that something as powerful as that went dark, how would I handle it? So I decided not to. And it wasn't until I started researching supernatural in 2003, really, that it became clear to me that I had to re-encounter psychedelics. I needed to go back, and I needed to take psychedelics again, because I was going to be talking about these visionary states of shamans, and that's when I learned about ayahuasca. And I learnt about the Amazon jungle and the presence. Not only were there shamans deliberately inducing deeply altered states of consciousness with this plant vehicle, with ayahuasca, but they were also painting their visions, rather as the ancient cave artists did. So it was obvious what I needed to do next, which was I needed to go to the Amazon and drink ayahuasca.
See, it's obvious, but it's a mark of the type of personality you are, the open mind that you have, that you embrace that challenge, because again, a closed mind would just not be open to that.
Indeed so. And actually, oddly, David Lewis Williams, although he's built his life's work on the role of psychedelics in the cave art, has never taken a psychedelic himself. I asked him that directly, and he said no, and I never will. But for me, it was that's what I had to do. I just, I can't talk authoritatively about it if I don't have these experiences myself. So I went out to the Amazon, started to drink ayahuasca, little knowing that it would become a lifetime practice for me, that it would far transcend research, and it would become something that was central to my own personal development.
So were you drawn to Don Francisco Montes Shuna and the Sachamama Ethnobotanical Lodge?
That was the first place I was drawn.
Because he was an artist as well?
Well, absolutely, yeah. The art was very important. I asked around, I made some connections, and that was recommended to me. So I was drawn there, and that became the first place that I really worked extensively with ayahuasca. The fact that he was doing art was very much part of it. And then, of course, I learned about Pablo Amaringo and others.
And so then, being an open mind, but also experiencing the raw intensity sometimes of these entheogenic psychedelic experiences, what was your first blush with that? How did you integrate that back to your rational mind, this numinous experience?
It was really intriguing. It was a really intriguing situation. First of all, these were very powerful experiences. My first couple of encounters with ayahuasca were not actually so powerful. I had to get to know it a bit, and I guess it had to get to know me. But it gradually, a number of things began to happen. First of all, I could understand clearly that in these experiences one does encounter seamlessly convincing other realms which are inhabited by intelligences. And I could see how, and this is before we touch on the question of the reality or not of those realms, I could see why encounters with those realms would lead automatically to belief in other levels of reality and in spirit worlds, for want of a better word. That's a very natural conclusion to come to from something like the ayahuasca experience. That we are surrounded and immersed in all the time by a normally invisible other reality, and that we may gain contact with it by entering trance, and we may see it. But then secondly, I began to feel, and I cannot prove this, there's no way of proving this, I don't believe it can be proven, but I began to feel that other reality was real. That this was not some fantastic concoction of my brain or some generalized concoction of human neurology, but that by shifting our state of consciousness, the reason that there are so many regularities, of course there are many irregularities as well. People do have different experiences in trance, but there are some profound common features which come up again and again all around the world today and in antiquity. The imagery that we find on the cave walls, particularly what is called the therianthrope, the creature that is part animal and part human in form, which manifests on cave walls 35,000 years ago, is still being seen by people in deeply altered states of consciousness today. And I myself have had such encounters, and I don't. It doesn't make sense to me that we have a brain module for therianthropes. It makes sense to me that there is some kind of intelligence out there that is able to, and chooses to manifest or appear to us in that form, and that we can really only see those entities in altered states of consciousness. So I do think there are freestanding other realities. That's, if I were a betting man, that's what I'd put my money on, and that altered states of consciousness are the vehicle to allow us to make contact with those other realities. And the evidence seems to show that when we make contact with those other realities, we do actually bring back material of fundamental importance, which has from time to time transformed human society. And allowed us to escape deeply embedded ruts of behavior and to shift into a new frequency as a culture, and to investigate and make new things possible that weren't possible before. I think there's very clear and compelling evidence for that. And the other thing that intrigued me was not only was I being given a direct insight and encounter with what I could only construe as other levels of reality, but also I was being confronted with certain truths about myself. And I was being given teachings that you, Graham Hancock, have a lot of work to do. You may be satisfied with yourself, but you have no reason to be satisfied with yourself. You have made a lot of errors and mistakes in the way that you've lived your life, and you have caused pain to others, and you need to put that right. I got that teaching again and again and again through ayahuasca. I still get it. That I need to fix certain stuff in my life. I need to abandon certain patterns of behavior. And this is very strange, this sense of an intimate contact with a powerful moral force, which is telling me very directly, showing me stuff which makes me realize that I must change certain patterns of behavior.
Once you know it, you can't deny it's there. You
can't deny it's there, and oddly, this is why I said just now that I had I don't want to put down marijuana at all, cannabis. I think it's a wonderful medicinal and healing plant. It has a great role in human culture, but it can be overused, and there can be problems with it. And I had problems with cannabis.
Different plants can be allies, or they cannot be allies.
They can be allies or not. And there was a time in my life when cannabis was an ally to me, when I started smoking it at the age of 37. I don't actually think I would ever have got into writing about historical mysteries if cannabis hadn't been in my life at that time. I think it played a huge role, but it began to dominate my life. And after 24 years of very, very heavy cannabis use, where I would never write a book unless I was continuously stoned. I was always, and I know what the critics are going to say about this. We knew Hancock was stoned all along. Well, I was.
It's the Stone Age, Graham.
It was the Stone Age, and I was smoking cannabis from morning to night, latterly in a vaporizer. But it began to play a dominant role in my life. And the interesting thing is that when I first encountered ayahuasca in 2003, ayahuasca did not address my cannabis habit. And it wasn't until 2011, and I realized why this happened, that in the last 4 or 5 years before 2011, say from 2005, 2006 on, maybe 7 onwards, my behavior had become more and more negative, and particularly towards my beloved partner and wife, Santha. I really now that I look back on those 4 or 5 years, I think I was pretty crazy, and I was very paranoid and very untrusting and very disbelieving. I was constantly projecting my own lack of trust out onto Santha, and giving her a very, very, very hard time and causing her a lot of pain, which it seemed to me perfectly, it was right, because I felt so untrusting, and in 2011. Cut a long story short, I had a series of 5 encounters with ayahuasca, which just gave me the most unbelievable kicking. I was just shown terror. I was shown myself poised on the edge of an abyss of total madness, that I had become deeply harmful, and that in some way my relationship with marijuana was tied up with this. And when I went back to England after that encounter with ayahuasca in 2011, I couldn't smoke marijuana anymore. I have never since, and I don't see myself doing so in the near future. And I feel relieved. I feel that a particular monkey has actually been taken off my back. My sense that I couldn't write my books without it has proved to be false. I'm actually more productive and more creative as a writer right now than I was when I was in the depth of that habit.
Ayahuasca can often shift on a vibrational. There's the emotional body, there's the vibrational body, but when those shifts happen on the interior, then you can let go of that old baggage.
It was very strange. It was very strange, and again, come back to this issue. We're dealing with some kind of intelligence and some kind of teacher here, because if anybody had said to me in September 2011 that a month from now you will not be smoking cannabis again, I would have said you must be joking, because it's so central to my life. But that's actually what happened. I had this series of truly terrifying and disturbing experiences, and afterwards I did actually try to smoke cannabis again, but I couldn't. I literally couldn't. I was filled with such horror and loathing. So there is a and I say that without wishing to put down others who have a relationship with cannabis, because cannabis can be very positive. It was my mistake. I had allowed it to become an over-dominant place in my life, and it needed to be taken out of my life. And somehow, astonishingly, just when that needed to happen, this entity, this intelligence behind ayahuasca took it out of my life.
The beauty of the weave, isn't it? Everything synchronously, omnipresently, just perfect. Something perfect. So when I say that these are the ancient teachers of mankind, I really mean it. This is. And they're the ancient teachers, but they're here now.
They're here now, and they're here to teach us now. And we do live at this curious juncture of the human story. The whole planet is in communication with itself. The whole human species is in communication, and we have gone down a dark technological path. And there is terrible hatred and fear and suspicion in the world. There are terrible, terrible emotions that are being stirred up and deliberately cultivated and generated by big power blocks to maintain control.
You have either a Gnostic or a Hermetic appreciation and understanding of that, don't you?
Yeah, I think Gnosticism is an ancient system of deconditioning, which just turns everything upside down and allows you what you believed was good, it shows you was not good, and that's clear with the Gnostic view of the thing that we call God, who to the Gnostics is a kind of demon who is misleading mankind, at the heart of Gnosticism is the notion of a direct encounter with the realm of spirit, or a direct encounter with the divine, but the real divine, not the devil posturing as God, who is the Gnostic demiurge.
Like, Russian dolls within Russian dolls, there's embedded sets of dimensional reality, and the earth, and then maybe the next level of demiurge. The demiurge, and beyond that, this realm of pure spirit, and that's what the Gnostics sought to contact.
and I believe they did so through altered states of consciousness. And it so happens, I've come to feel this quite strongly, that Gnosticism as a system of teachings is really not available to us anymore. We can access it through the Nag Hammadi library. It is possible to study it and read it, and it's mind-blowing when you really get to grips with those texts. You suddenly get it. You realize, my goodness, this just explains so much. That we are living in this illusory reality that's being created, that's programming us, that's pulling our strings, that's making us behave in a way that's quite contrary and alien to our nature, which we see manifesting all around the world. But the Gnostic, reading the texts isn't enough. The Gnostic route to gnosis, to this enlightening direct encounter with the divine, that is not available through the texts. The texts get you thinking, but they don't give you that experience. And what does or can give you that experience is agents like ayahuasca. They are Gnostic instruments, and that's why I do think we see all around the world people's lives being transformed by contact with ayahuasca, leading them to ask questions about the nature of the civilization we live in today that they might never have considered asking before. And that's, of course, why these substances are illegal, and why they're persecuted, and why they're condemned, and why society invests, really enormous amounts of money in trying to persuade us that we must not touch them or have contact with them. That is the demiurge keeping us away from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's what's going on there.
How was Supernatural received?
Well, it was received with much less criticism from the academic establishment than my work on prehistory.
Because it's outside their sort of...
I guess it's outside their sort of area, and because I guess I'd learnt over the years how to deal with the critical apparatus of academia. For example, there was an argument within academics that the cave art couldn't have been influenced by psychedelic experience because psilocybin mushrooms, which would have been the key agent, were not available in Europe until after contact with the New World. And believe it or not, this argument was made by a group of mainstream academics who sought to destroy that particular interpretation of cave art by saying, yeah, very fine, very clever, but they didn't have mushrooms until after 1500.
Wow. Looked at the original texts, have they?
No, not at all.
The Bibles, the Vatican's hidden.
Absolutely,
the mushrooms.
Absolutely, the mushrooms are everywhere, and not only that, but so I was confronted by that. I realised that the case I wanted to make in Supernatural, which seemed to me compelling and obvious, that psychedelics had played a key role in this imagery, that I needed to address that critique that was there. So I went out and I got a mycologist to do a detailed DNA study of psilocybe semilanciata in the New World and psilocybe semilanciata in Europe, and to tell me from the DNA, do they have a point? Could it be true that this psilocybe was brought from the New World after contact? And after the DNA study was done, he went on record and said, absolutely no way could that be true. These two species of psilocybe semilanciata have been evolving separately for tens of thousands of years. Psilocybe semilanciata is ancient in Europe.
That's what interests me. When you've got verifiable primary data that's outside the agendas of the vested interests, but it's out there and it's published in things like yours, but then it's just ignored still by the mainstream. They don't seem to absorb.
They ignore it. That's the way, you see. The fact is that part of the reason why Supernatural has not been attacked as much as Fingerprints of the Gods was is that Supernatural has not been as popular as Fingerprints of the Gods was. It has its readership, but it's not a readership in millions. It's not all over the world.
What was the title again of Richard Dawkins? He had a very florid title.
He was a professor of the public understanding of science at Oxford University, which is a classic Orwellian use of language, and that we are to only understand science through the dogmas and teaching of this individual. He is undoubtedly a very clever and very eloquent man, and that's why I feel that I would like to see Richard Dawkins have.
You pointed that question to him.
I did put that question to him. I took the opportunity and I sat down with Luis Eduardo Luna, who's an old friend of mine who works a lot with ayahuasca, and he and I concocted a question for Richard Dawkins, which was meant to put him on a fork. The question was really to say that as a scientist, he must be aware that there are ancient tribal and hunter-gatherer societies who do believe that there are other levels of reality, which they refer to as spirit worlds, and so on and so forth. And as a scientist, would he be willing to challenge his own view of the nature of reality by embracing the technologies that these ancient shamanistic cultures use to access those spirit realms? In other words, hallucinogens, in other words, psychedelics. And that the purpose of the question was very simple, that if he said no, he wouldn't be willing to embrace that, then he could hardly define himself as a scientist anymore. And if he said yes, he would be willing to embrace it, then he needs to put his money where his mouth is and actually go embrace it.
He did say yes, didn't he?
And he did say yes.
So I hope because the follow-up is happening.
Well, the follow-up is happening.
Because it'd be very easy to link up the legal pathways in the UK.
Yeah, that's right. And some people who I know for sure who are doing serious scientific psilocybin research have approached Richard Dawkins and said, well, you said you would do this, so and you said you'd do it under certain conditions with medical supervision, assured that it will be safe for you. We're ready to provide you with those. So please go ahead. And I don't know but ultimately he has said he will do it and the right conditions are being made available to him. So if he fails to do it, then I think he loses credibility as a scientist. I think it just loses it completely if he fails to do that. And I'm not saying that if he does, I personally don't think that one experience is enough, but that if he does go, I'm not saying that if he goes that route he will be totally transformed. People do bring their baggage to psychedelic experiences and seek to construe them through those baggages, but I do think it might have an effect.
I guess in a way we're talking about these cultural gatekeepers of the culture, and if someone like that was to do it, it may be, like the iceberg melts.
I think so.
Ripple starts.
I think so. I think if Richard Dawkins were to have an experience that did challenge his very narrow, material-based view of reality, and if he were to go on record about that, I think it would have a dramatic effect in the culture.
And we're seeing that, there's the MAPS organisation in the US and globally, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, sponsoring so many tests across the world with the medical establishment and the scientific community. And there's so many tests that are replicating in a way almost what was happening in the 60s with all the medical tests. We're coming up to that threshold again. Yeah. Yet we're seeing, the government and the forces to be, they might ban medical marijuana still. Like there's still these...
It's astonishing,
amazing polarity of energies happening.
There is. And let's not forget that there are vast amounts of public money invested in the so-called war on drugs. And what that means is that large, enormously well-funded bureaucracies, armed bureaucracies, have been set up to prosecute the war on drugs, and that those large armed bureaucracies invest a great deal of money in public relations, our money, which is designed to persuade us that their point of view is right. This is a self-perpetuating machine, actually devoid from any particular individual, which will go on. And then those who are invested, let's not forget that also tens of thousands of jobs are invested in persecuting the use of drugs.
It reminds me of a crusade, doesn't it? It's the same historical resonance happening again, and we're talking about this entity, this life force, this hierarchy, that perpetuates itself, whether it's called a Roman Empire or American Empire or the corporate agenda at the moment. There's still that same type of energy attached to it.
Very much so, and it's very much attached to the war on drugs. So ending that particularly evil manifestation of control is I believe going to be extremely difficult. It's not going to be easy, simply because there is so much institutional capital invested in perpetuating the war on drugs. But I think that it is unpicking, and the reason that it's unpicking is also to do with the global nature of communications now, that people are in touch with one another all around the world, and that there is profound dissatisfaction with the model we've been stuck with for the last several thousand years of the big dominator culture, the centrally controlled state, the centrally controlled religions, the big corporations. All of these have actually run their course. They may not believe it yet.
I think they know it. And they're trying to retrofit as they go.
They're trying to retrofit as they go, but the fact is it isn't working anymore. And people around the world do see that. And there's a restlessness and an impatience for a new way forward. And in the absence of any initiative from the point of the big powers. That initiative is being found spontaneously by people, and oddly, there's an odd way in which the war on drugs actually works against the centralized hierarchy and authority, because what it's done is it's prompted the creation of completely independent underground networks of people who are in contact with one another.
Mystery culture, mystery schools again.
Yeah, rather like the mystery schools. And I feel that with ayahuasca today, that when we talk about drinking ayahuasca and working with ayahuasca, it's rather like being in one of those Gnostic sects.
Except it's very public, and Jennifer Aniston did it in her latest
that's
movie.
right, which is bringing it out into the culture. It's transcending. So I do feel, we are poised on the edge of an epoch of hope.
And funnily enough, this epoch of hope is happening just at the tail end of this 26,000-year orbit that the Maya predicted in other indigenous cultures with world ages. What a coincidence!
Yeah, or not.
Or not,
because what the Maya, of course, the Maya themselves were the inheritors of their calendar, not really the creators of it. It was an old calendar already when they became a culture 2,200, 2,300 years ago. The current cycle of the Mayan calendar has a specific beginning date, which is in August of 3014 BC, and it has a specific end date, which is the 21st of December 2012. And that does not mean, and it's wrongly taken, anybody who takes that to suggest that the Maya were saying the world will end on the 21st of December 2012. It's not
age of the world.
An epoch ends. The Maya were not predicting the end of the world. That cycle that began in 3014 BC started a day after a previous cycle ended. And what's interesting to me is that cycle from 3114 BC to today is the cycle of the big centralized state, is the cycle of the big centralized religions, and is the cycle of a particular form of consciousness.
What is the next? Is that the age of Aquarius?
Well, that's not so much the age. No, that's the in terms of astrological ages, the last 5,126 years spans the age of Taurus, the age of Aries, and the age of Pisces. It spans really those three ages. It's not a precise fit, but it spans those three ages, and we are on the cusp. If you look at it purely in astronomical terms, we're not quite in Aquarius yet. You really need. It depends where you draw the boundaries of the constellation, but for Aquarius to be housing the sun fully, you need another 200 or 300 years to pass before we're fully in the age of Aquarius. But that's a moot point, exactly where the boundaries of the constellations are drawn. We're certainly transitioning out of Pisces, and we're transitioning into Aquarius in astrological terms now. We're at a cusp moment, and we are at the end of a 5,000-year period of history that has been dominated by centralized controlling hierarchies, and we are at a time when all over the world a new spirit is dawning, and people are questioning that, and that is true, even though the end of the world I do not believe is true. I don't think that there's any suggestion in the Mayan calendar that
the end of the world as we know it is the famous song.
At the end of the world as we know it. At the end of a certain way of doing things, and it's high time that came. We are at a time when a new way forward needs to be found, and is being found. It is being found. It is happening, and a new idea is at root in human culture. And I think it's clear that it's an idea whose time has come, and that it is spreading around the world. It won't be easy. It won't be just a simple overnight transition. It's a process. The old system will hang on. It will continue to cause pain and suffering. But the new one is being birthed, and it can't be stopped. That's my view.
Would you call it the end of his story?
The end of his story and the beginning of her story. Yeah.
Graham Hancock, many thanks.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.